Okay, this video is going to be dedicated to the creation of UV and UV shells. There's a couple of technical things we have to talk about before we get into even more technical things. That's dealing specifically with my mesh and character here, but likely will relate to yours as well, involving the eyelashes, the eyeballs, and other parts that need special attention and care before you start working on it. You may also, if you want, skip to the 10-minute mark of this video to straight away begin the UV creation. We will, however, go over some important issues that you should know, but if you're just spinning your wheels and want to start, just skip ahead. Alright, we want to talk about some parts of the head that need to be separate and need to be protected or have their own UVs, and we need to control some of those. Our first step for our UV work is to hide everything else that we're not working on, including the eyes, and a few caveats about protecting accidentally moving or manipulating part of the eyes unwittingly as you work. And not just turning off the eyes here that have a layer for it, but also turning off these guys that say C cluster part of the rig of the eyes. And just to remember that the eyes are separate objects. They're not going to be part of the mesh. They have their own UVs. They have their own stuff going on. The logic would be the eyes become part of the overall rig of the character. If the character had a skeleton for its whole body, including head, then the eyes would be parented or constrained to a bone inside this character's head. Meanwhile, they have to remain separate because they have to be able to look around and pivot inside the head and have that degree of freedom. And to answer the question how the eyes move within the head without popping out or falling out, it's because when the rigging process begins, then those eyeballs, or the parent of which, begins assignment to the same skeleton that the face mesh is skinned to or assigned to. Okay, and just one final caveat about the eyes being rigs. As you see in the eyeliner, it has many different parts to it, which we went over before, and it makes it fragile in a way, as any rig is breakable or fragile, even if there's efforts to lock or protect parts. You might see, if you're using these eyes, these little C's here, these C's that show up, and these are for what's called clusters. And these clusters, although we're not going to go into that part of rigging right now, these clusters also belong to the eyeballs. And it's kind of interesting and freaky because if you grab these clusters and let's say you accidentally made a mistake by scaling them, whoa, you can get some accidental bizarre effects. And so what's happening is these clusters are involved in changing the iris size, and it's part of the rig, but they have to stay outside of the hierarchy of the rig in order to operate. Just mind that these clusters can be put on a layer and hidden, otherwise they can be accidentally, selected, and if they're moved or rotated, you're just going to get absolutely weird, kind of bizarre looking effects. So that would be kind of cool if you had that in an animation backup of it. On my rig, I'll just put them on a layer and hide them so I don't accidentally grab and move them. Now, before we set a projection and we start with our initial UV work on this head, there's one thing we have to take care of, and that's the eyelashes. We extruded the edges to create these eyelashes, to create nice, thin, and simple geometry. But it can create, as we saw before, a possible non-manifold topology error if we didn't make that fix. If we already did, it's fine. But also it creates a problem with the UVing and unfolding process. If you made eyelashes on your character similar to mine here, you may have a problem with non-manifolds. I'll show you a very easy way to correct it, and that's what we're going to do in the workflow anyway, and that is separate the eyelashes as separate cards, in the same way you might do hair in the future. Well, how do you do that, and how do you prevent against non-manifold topology? What you have to do is go to each one of these lashes, and we'll just start by selecting the faces of the eyelash. Then I'm going to show you how to detach them. That is, detach that geometry from the base geometry of the head. And after make the selection, do make sure you don't have anything else you don't want selected. Then say Edit Mesh, Detach. Okay, now the curious thing is, you'd think that would detach it, and it didn't, and it just moves it as if it didn't detach. Well, there's a setting This is why you're using history. If you look over in your inputs in your history, you see the last operation that you did, polysplit edge. This operation says manifold. Click on that and click the next option, which is non-manifold. Okay, then it's going to pull it off as a separate object. Now you may or may not have to do that on parts of your mesh. Just know that you have that tool and power available. Yes, there's a mesh cleanup for your non-manifold geometry, but this is something you'd have to do anyway for a clean production line. One more step to do, because if we look at the outliner and we select all the mesh, it's still, although detached, it's selecting with the original mesh. Select these faces once again of the eyelash, then go into mesh and click separate. Now you have a truly separate object and a separate mesh, and it shows up right here in outliner as a separate piece of geometry now. So you're going to have to do that with every eyelash, only 3 more, just to make sure as you're going along the way with your head-up display here, your CVs don't have extra or they're doubling up in anywhere unbeknownst to you. And I did the bottom eyelash, and if you had moved it out to see that separation, you want to move it back, and you hit the W to move it. Pivot could have shifted. Always handy tools. Modify, center pivot to bring that pivot back and put it back into place. Then and again, and just a little reminder, you can double click on the move tool. You can change the axis orientation from objects, and that can change the manipulator orientation. I'm going to send it back on world, and also to show you, you can hit edit pivot. You click edit pivot and you can change any of the way the pivot is facing. For delicate modeling, you might have to change that because it's not moving. It's just a very convenient thing to do. It's similar to hitting the home key or insert key to change the position of the pivot. This lets you rotate it right here in the double clicking on the move tool settings. Okay, and then just clicking off edit pivot, and then you can move it straight back just like you like it. This time we're going to sink in the eyelash a little bit inside of the flesh as well. Okay, so same deal with this. We could edit the pivot. Okay, like that. If that ever occurs, you can easily handle that issue. Also, another little tip I'd like to show you. Let's say you wanted to resculpt something like this, or one of the bottom eyelash. You want to make it longer, thicker, and you just wanted to hug or connect to the existing flesh here. There's something called Make Live, and if I select the face of the mesh and say Modify, Make Live, that's going to make, if I move these points, it's going to make it stick. See how that is sort of magnetized? So I can reformulate this and stick to the flesh to make this quick and manipulatable, let's say. So when you select the head and select on a Modify, Make Live, the head mesh becomes this green color. It means it's ready to draw upon. It kind of makes a magnet out of it, so anything you're drawing on it will stick to it. And it's a great way to sculpt something that's form-fitting around the contours of it. So kind of cool to have if you want to rethink of how any of the parts that might be separate. And this will definitely come into play if you're making hair cards on the top of the head. So again, that's Make Live. And when you're finished doing that, you can go up to Modify, Make Not Live. Otherwise, it's going to keep sticking to it. You have to turn it off. But like I said, I'm going to sink this a little bit inside the flesh. When I later do a transparency map, you'll see why. So something like that. Okay, so I finished the other eye and the other eyelash. I just wanted to make sure I named everything. To keep in good housekeeping, I said left lower lash for that, as these are now separate meshes, and that's right upper lash, and I'll rename that to right lower lash. Okay, all this will allow us to have the texture consideration separate for the eyelashes, as well as what might come from the hair systems or hair solutions coming in later, and of course the eyes, which are separate entities and rigs to the head. Yet all of these are going to come together. They're going to be in the same envelope, so to speak, UV, and as well as If this character were rigged, all of it would be moving together naturally. Okay, this next video is mainly going to be focused on UV setup, creating UVs, using cuts with the UV toolkit, and unfolding them in the UV editor. It likely could be one of the most tedious parts of the project before you start painting on it because you might be eager to do so. Yet in our classic workflow here, it's essential that we do set those up and get on with it. So I'm going to show you a pretty simple way to approach it and also note some of the pitfalls and errors that can happen along the way. Now, to start creating UVs for the head, there are many different ways you can approach it. I'm going to show you just one way that I think works well for this particular design. There's a plethora of demos out there that can show you alternative ways, and you can find for yourself a best approach. The first step in which we will do is to project UVs on the head. We can't start cutting it up without a projection to begin with. You might remember with your hand or with your body, we started with a planar projection, UV projection. Some might think, okay, this is a cylindrical head, why not do cylindrical projection? That may be equally as valid, but in this step, we're going to start with a planar projection. Before we do, let's make sure all other parts are turned off. The eyelashes are turned off, the eyeballs, of course, so just a head mesh. Okay, UV planar option box, and what we're aiming for here is the side of the head. So I know that it's coming at me here in the x-axis, so I'm going to select project from the x-axis. Project gives me sort of a rectangular framing projection, and we can look now in the UV editor what's going to colorize, and it's going to give one half a red, one half tinted blue. What's overlapping? Well, a quick tip, go here, the projection width and height, where it says 23 and some change and 28. Just put 25 for both, which will make the projection square and won't distort the projection shape. Now, Maya has this checkerboard, a technique to put a checkerboard. If I click it, you could see where it's stretching by a checker test. Some users don't prefer it for a couple reasons, because one, it's not color coded. It also doesn't have a numbering system and it's not as scalable. So often users that do this every day bring in their own checkerboard file. If you would like, you could just Google UV checkerboard or UV checker map, import anyone that you like might serve better. All right, moving on to our cuts. We see here in the UV editor we have a side view because we placed the projection on the x-axis. Next, for our cuts, we're going to put cuts in some strategic places. So we're going to start with making cut right here above the eyebrow, like that. And so it's just selecting the edges, like here, and you can see through what I've selected. It might be totally different for your character, what logic goes into how you cut. This is one strategy. And then I'm going to select this that goes all the way around the head as well. And I'll show you a quick tip. If you hold shift down, that is, and double click, you see how that whole line, edge all the way between, becomes selected, that range. So let's double check. Let's look in the view and make sure we don't have any other edges we don't want selected. Here's the toolkit, UV toolkit, and we have our cut tool right there. We're going to click cut. And that's our first incision. Okay. For my next cut, I'm going to cut down here at the throat, right here. About here for the chin, right there and right there. Look about there. Okay, make sure you look around and you didn't get anything else by accident, and then you make another cut. Next, you want to cut around the ears, so we're going to cut the ears out. So if you built in nice edge rings, as all the workflow goes hand in hand, you should be able to cut a nice ring like this around the ear. Double check, make sure nothing else on the edge is included in that except the ones you want, and cut that. And then the last ear here, cut around. You may be thinking about symmetry. If this model were perfectly symmetrical, I could just turn on symmetry. Then I could just do both at the same time, since both ears are symmetrical. I'm going to cut that real quick. And cut. This is an important thing to note, because for an everyday user, when you model one thing on one side, you want the other side selected as well. We talked about that earlier in the videos. If I have just a polygon sphere here and I select maybe one face on one side, it's not, of course, selecting a reflection of the other side unless I turn on symmetry. There's different ways to do that, once through the marking menus, but also simply through this tool right here in the tool settings. I double click the move tool. Then I have symmetry settings right here. Currently by default set for off. I can set that for the objects X, Y, and Z, plane of reflection, or the world X, Y, and Z, topology too. So if I set it for X, you can see when I select one face, the symmetry for another face is selected. Probably be good for making eyes or ears coming out symmetrical. Could be a preferred modeling method. Well, it goes to take it for granted perhaps that this requires that your mesh is perfectly symmetrical. So one side has to have the exact point value that the other side has. So this particular mesh is slightly asymmetrical because of the work I did on some of the left eye versus the right eye, and a little bit different here and there. So even if it's just a little bit different, if I tried symmetry on here, it's not going to work on the other side. Now, if I did want it to work, I could just select one side of the face, delete it, and then mirror it again so I know it's absolutely symmetrical, and then that tool would work. So that's an FYI if that's your workflow. It's also a predictive workflow if you want to have a symmetrical design and instance as we model. If you have a very asymmetrical character head, there is one workaround. You can force the symmetry to be topology. Then it prompts you to choose a center line edge, and then after that it will guess your symmetry for you. Okay, well, back to our head, and we made all the cuts. Now we're going to unfold the pieces in the UV editor and toolbox. I can right click, and there's a number of ways I could do this. I could just right click and say in the UV editor UV shell. That's going to turn red, highlight the shells. You have the two ears already separated here. Well, I can grab the head, and I'm going to unfold this, but I'm not just going to click unfold. I'm going to click unfold along U, so I know it's unfolding along the U. This is what I'm going to get. And I could take that ear, unfold it, and that ear, and unfold it. All right, so before we go any further, please skip to the last part of this video if Maya crashes on you when unfolding. Even if it didn't crash, please watch this full video, including the end, to learn how to fix topology errors, because you're going to have to know this at some point. All right, so now it becomes a bit obvious what I paint on here. Check for little errors that could have come along the way in the fabric, so to speak. Like here's a little split I didn't intend. If you grab those two in UV and then right click, and you can sew them together. Just on a cut sew, click merge, and then those two become one. Any little splits there, you can merge edges in the UV, you can merge CVs. Really, you're merging UVs and combining UV shells when you do that, making one larger continuous piece of fabric, as it were. Okay, we're just begun arranging this, but first, when we look at how it's unfolded or laid out here, it's still kind of tight and clustered together. We need to relax those CVs and edges, so we're going to use a tool called Optimize. So let's just start with the face part. We're going to select it to UV shell, or just UV shell, and highlights in red. Just click the face shell and right click, and then we're going to modify, and we're going to optimize, and we're going to option box. Iterations, I just put 1, or left it at default, or put it on 1 and say apply. Let's just see what happens. Click it, and it kind of smooths it out a little bit more. Now overall, that optimize was fairly a small change, so if we hit the G key to repeat the last command, apply again, and you can see what's happening. A little more uniformity. We're just trying to relax it as much as we can. Okay, now of course I could do the same with the ears and optimize the smoothness with it. And it gets to a level it stops. It's already pretty relaxed, so optimizing has a nuanced effect on it till almost nil. Let's begin by arranging all these pieces of the puzzle in the 0-1 space. Again, with the UV shell selector, right click, we're going to modify. Let's go to layout, and layout just lays them somewhat generically in the 0-1 space. It's just kind of a quick arrange. I'm going to grab the two ears and I'm put them down here to use up that hollow space here. And I'm going to push this up, maximize the room that I'm taking up as much as possible. I am going to bring all these UVs together eventually for the body and the rest of the character, but here I'm just maximizing it for the 0, 1 space for the moment. And as we're going, we could check checkerboard here to see if we have any stretching going on. And the goal is to see more uniformity all around, and we can see clearly where the borders are and much less stretching, of course, than before. We did cut off the ears so we can get a nice flat unfolding of each ear. Here's a little technique. If you want, you can kind of place them back in, scale it down just a bit, make sure they don't overlap. If you wanted, you could sew them back together, edge to edge, the way we sewed and repaired that little part right here. Why did we cut them off in the first place? Again, it's to lie just a concentrated area very flat and unfolded, which would be difficult if it was still contributing to the mesh of the head. And sew them back together if you like. Same tool we used before. Right click on a UV, then go cut, sew, merge. G to repeat the last command. Okay, so that's a nice and flatter result than you would get if you try to flatten the head all at once. Again, symmetry in the UV and the mesh would help do this. Now for the eyes, we can see there's problems of it peaking and overlapping. We can go more surgically and select all these UVs around the eye and the culprit parts. Right click, modify, and use that same optimize tool. Just click optimize and it gets it to more manageable shape and look, and then do it again on the key areas you'd like to repeat and just hit G to repeat that last tool. So you could just then hand grab some of these and bring them in. This is skin folded upon itself in the eye, so likely you're not going to see it or detect it as much, but it's good not to have anything overlapping like that. For the nose and the nostrils, that I suppose it's okay to have it purple overlapping areas. No one's going to look inside his nose for a close-up probably. And same deal for the mouth. If there's parts really overlapping, as long as the character in this situation is not talking, we're just going to keep them sealed and covered over. If the character does become an active animated one that needs to talk, needs to open its mouth, you'd cut a whole UV shell, separate that and unfold it custom for the mouth. Until that day, we're just going to keep it like this and for this assignment. Looking at the overall layout, it looks nicely paintable now, and you might be wondering why we have splits here. In order to get minimization of stretching, looking at how they're laying out and how the distortion is occurring, to minimize it by splitting the head this way, which means you can decide on your shape of your character whether you want to sew these edges together, the balance between, let's say, stretching and sewing them together as one more easily paintable thing. So yes, we could have this where this is actually sewn back together as such, but what happens if we do that then is we get more stretching here. As a three-dimensional object, it's got to come apart somehow. You're putting pressure either on one area or another area. And remember, the other place you can show stretching visibly is the icon for UV distortion. So it color codes where it's stretching or compressing in blue or pink. If you grab a UV and move it, it's a heat map where blue represents compaction and red or pink represents stretching. So you're aiming for white. You can split them apart or cut them again in these tools by right clicking. You can see how it could be a trick of trying to represent little stretching as possible versus an easy painting layout. And with the ear, you can see that it's getting a little stretched. When I enlarge it, it turns white. So I'm aiming for a happy medium, and coming as reasonably closest to the medium between, which is white, and striking a balance. Now, just to remember where we're going to, in traditional texturing, we would bring this as a UV snapshot into Photoshop and start painting on it, and that process is still going to work for us now. It's probably the simplest one. It is true that nowadays most people are painting and texturing PBR based, other applications that can paint right on the mesh contemporaneously, of course. Substance Painter is an example of that. And once it's UV'd like this, it can of course be brought into Mudbox or ZBrush to fine tune and work with it there. We're going to stick with the super basics here and just use Photoshop approach, assuming that you might not have access to those tools. Okay, now for the eyelash UVs, we're going to prep them separately. Remember, we detached them from the head. By the way, we finished with the head UVing. We can delete the history. All right, we have this separated. We are going to give each one of these, each one of the four, upper and lower, their own planar projections. Just take the top one here. We're going to planar and option box. Make sure you select the Y and click apply. Now we can see it's not quite perfect. If you click this little red line here in the X, you can interactively rotate it, because you can click that and rotate it a bit like that better. To optimize or relax that, it looks pretty good. It's so simple as is. You probably don't need a whole lot of changing here. Maybe a little bit of reshaping. Continue with the other three. Okay, and then just looking at once in the UV window while selecting all four, you see them all represented right here in the UV editor. But let's put them off to the side just for the moment, like off the side of the 0, 1 space like that, and we're going to click on the head. We have a couple choices here. We could include these lashes in the UV paint space 0, 1 of the head and have that as 1, or we could keep them separately as their own UV set or own UV painting. And there's a couple reasons to do different things here. If we want them together in one, simply what we could do is select with shift all four and the head mesh and say mesh combine. That puts them all as one, and now you can UV them as one as well and bring in the UV shell and place them, resize them perhaps and find a space for them. And remember, we're going to combine all those together eventually. There would be a reason not to keep them together, although this would be the most efficient. Well, one reason is this, is because we plan to make a transparency card for these. We have to do it in a 0, 1 space. That means this whole image in 0, 1 has to contain an alpha channel. And that, if it got to a 4K or 3K very large texture, might be very heavy. It's not a big deal, then we just create a channel to go along with it. But if it's a size issue, then we should create something that might be faster in real time, and that's create a separate smaller map just for the transparencies of the eyelashes. Now, if that was not too understandable what to do, it depends on what you're making this for and how fast you want it to run. If you want everything to run in real time, the best idea might be to find a solution to have just a small transparency card only for these, in the same way we did the feathers for the body. It just might not make much of a performance difference, but what I'm going to do for this particular model, I'm going to have separate small map just for the transparency of the eyelashes. Not combine these at the moment. I'm going to go back up into mesh and separate. Now I have the separate meshes back, and when I look at it, only that's on there. I can hit 3 to smooth them, and they're back and separate. So combine and separating just puts them into the same mathematical space. It doesn't fuse them permanently together, and that's really nice, because you're going to need to know that if you ever take rigging and you want the head separate to make facial expressions and shape animations, yet you want it combined as one mesh for the texture. Okay, to wrap up the UV for my head, I'm going to leave it as is, so maximizing that space. And for the eyeball, it's all set. We don't need to do anything. Remember, they're already UV'd. And for these, for the UVs that we set up for the eyelashes, we can put them in the 0, 1 space and be a hog and take up all the space we want. But this is going to be a much smaller file. It's a much smaller size file that only describes the eyelashes in transparency. All right, so we're ready to go on to actual painting and going through the careful and hopefully not quite as painful step of UV layout in preparation. I wanted to have a dedicated section here just about the things that can go wrong, about unfolding and general topology, and some operations which could crash Maya. I just want to show more of the pitfalls that anyone can accidentally fall into along the way. Here we have the ears separated from the head, 3 separate shells, and I'm selecting the head shell. And then I choose in my UV toolbox, unfold, I get a fatal error. which actually crashes Maya altogether. So if you get that, of course you're going to wonder why. Why is this? It could be a couple things. I'm going to show you a few culprits it may be. One, it may just be the cuts that you've used and it can't figure out how to unfold it. Then you could use unfold along UV and see if it can unfold it along one of those. I showed you that. Test to see if it can figure out how to unfold under just U or just V. Well, that might not solve your problem, and probably that's not a very satisfying answer. So more to the essence could be that your mesh has a problem with it. It could be CVs extra that are not combined, a messy mesh. Could be double edges, lamina faces, something sharing a multiple edge, or non-manifold geometry problems in your topology, combined with the reasons why it can't unfold it and it crashes. Now, we happen to know off the bat for my model, I extruded the eyelashes out of edges out of the eyelids for each eye, and those result in possible non-manifolds, that is, geometry that cannot be unfolded. Now, that is just one reason among many I had them separated and detached. The other is for the process and the texturing of the transparency maps. And you might have a character in which you want to simply extrude an edge to create some kind of a thin surface thing. And yes, it might be the easiest thing to do in this situation, but it could cause unfolding and topology problems down the line. Just note that you'll have to reorganize things if so. Now, because we detached and separated our eyelashes and we weren't even doing any operations on it, we know that's not the source of the error in this case. So there's other things in the mesh to look at. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways to fix very common topology errors and in the process fix our particular error for my mesh. Well, one thing that's sort of one reprieve when Maya crashes is when it reopens, it tries to autosave and save a .ma file. You'll see here in the corner a crash log column. If you zoom in, you can see that it auto-loaded a crash save file. That may or may not work. You can click on it. I think most of the time it would have saved it, and if you click right there where the latest MA, it's saved in a default location, it will reopen the last place you were with the file. It's not 100% reliable, as I mentioned, and it might not be the very minute it crashed. It might lose some stuff still, but it is a nice saving grace that it loads it there. So if we click on it, we actually do have the head back at the precise place that it did crash. Let's just remember and note that that crash log is there. And then, of course, after a crash, you should save it to the proper location and with a new name. Now, one thing you could do right off the bat is go to Mesh Cleanup option box. You recall we did that, I think, for the hand and the body in places where we can clean up or remove geometry, lamina faces, or remove non-manifold geometry. Those things can cause all kinds of problems, not just an unfolding. That could be a first stage, and then you could see if that fixes it or tests it. So I know that not to be the case, but it's something you shouldn't throw out as a deduction or possibility to clean up your mesh. Just mesh cleanup. So that right there might solve a lot of problems and some modeling pitfalls and crashes. But there's a deeper one to do, and if you select all of the CVs of the head, that's the first step. We're going to make sure there's no doubles or double CVs or edges. Just select every CV of the entire mesh you're dealing with, and then we're going to go up to the merge tool, edit mesh merge option box. Then for the threshold, put 0.001, very small. So any double CVs that exist, like a needle in a haystack, is going to be fused into only one, which all were supposed to be in the first place. Now we're going to do the same thing but with edges. So we select on the components, this time edge, and then we're going to select the whole mesh that's in question, not missing anything. Then quite the same thing, we go to the merge option box, but this time you could put 0.01 would be better setting for it, and then merge. Okay, that could have taken care of that needle in the haystack, whether it dealt with CVs or edges. And if you merged all CVs and edges in the proper uniformity, faces fall directly by the wayside. So they too must be correct if the others are. Now, if this error happened during the unfolding process, you should also delete the UVs. In the UV editor window, you're going to have to go edit, delete UVs. And yes, that means the cuts will go away and you'll have to recut them. It won't take you long. A little closer view of that, you just go up in the UV editor under edit and delete with the mesh selected, and that will delete the UVs for the selected mesh. Nothing there now. So those operations in combination with just having good eyes and observational skills will help find that error in the mesh, the topology, the needle in the haystack without worrying too much about it, and could likely prevent a lot of stress and crashes, and it's just a good house cleaning habit for modeling and production all through the future. And here you see it unfolding without a crash. Now, none of this is saying this is precisely the reason that yours is crashing. It could be that it can't unfold based on the cuts you made and made error and still crashes. Do explore that as well.